You can't stay where you are and expect to see what God promised. Every great move of God begins with a step of faith. And sometimes that step means leaving the familiar, walking away from comfort, and stepping into the unknown, because that's where destiny is waiting. The place that once felt safe now feels small. The people that once understood you can't see your vision anymore. Don't panic. It's not rejection, it's redirection. God is breaking you out of limitation so He can launch you into elevation. He's saying, if you'll step out of where you've been, I'll take you to where you were born to be. This next level isn't for the fearful. It's for the faithful. The doors won't open until your feet move. Faith requires movement, not comfort. That single truth separates those who talk about destiny from those who actually walk into it. Too many people pray for elevation while clinging to the very places God is trying to move them from. Faith will never grow in the soil of safety. It lives, breathes, and thrives only when you're willing to move beyond what feels predictable and step into what feels impossible. God doesn't need you to understand the whole plan. He just needs you to trust that His plan is better than your comfort. Every time God called someone to greatness, He required movement. Abraham had to leave his father's house. Moses had to leave the backside of the desert. Peter had to step out of the boat. Each of them had to let go of where they were to become who they were meant to be. The blessing wasn't in the place they were standing. It was in the place God was leading. Faith doesn't stay still, it steps forward. And sometimes that step won't make sense to anybody else around you. But the voice of God isn't always comfortable. It saws convicting. It stirs something inside of you that refuses to settle for less than what He promised. The challenge is that comfort feels good. It's predictable. It's familiar. But what's familiar can become fatal when it limits your growth. God will start to make your comfort zone uncomfortable because He knows if He doesn't disturb you, you'll never move. That frustration you feel isn't failure. It's divine agitation. It's God shaking the nest so you can learn how to fly. You've been praying for promotion, but He's saying, I can't promote you while you're still holding on to your security blanket. A faith doesn't consult your feelings. If you wait until you feel ready, you'll never move. God never called you to walk by sight because sight depends on what you can control. Faith depends on what only He can do. When you move in faith, you step into a realm where logic doesn't rule. God does. He opens doors you couldn't see, makes ways you couldn't plan, and provides resources you didn't even know existed. Every miracle in the Bible required somebody to move first. The Red Sea didn't part until Moses stretched out his rod. The walls of Jericho didn't fall until the people marched. The lame man didn't walk until he obeyed the command, rise, take up your bed, and walk. God's power responds to movement. Faith is never passive. You can't pray for change and stay in the same position. You can't say you trust God and refuse to take the step He told you to take. Every time you delay your movement, you delay your miracle. Sometimes you've been waiting on God, but the truth is, God is waiting on you. Waiting on you to start the business, to leave that toxic environment, to walk away from that old habit, to forgive, to apply, to try again. Faith without movement is just talk, and talk never changes a thing. The reason movement is so essential is because faith isn't proven in what you believe. It's proven in what you're willing to do because you believe. It's one thing to say you trust God. It's another thing to take the first step when there's no visible sign of how it'll work out. That's where real faith lies, in the tension between uncertainty and obedience. You might not see the whole staircase, but faith says, I'll take the first step anyway. Because if God spoke it, He's already gone ahead of you to prepare the way. When you refuse to move, you limit what God can release. The promise doesn't manifest in stagnation. Think about the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. God had already promised them the land, but they spent years circling the same mountain because they refused to move in faith. The same thing happens today. People keep praying for new seasons while replaying old patterns. Faith doesn't circle, faith advances. It looks beyond the obstacles and focuses on the God who is greater than the opposition. Sometimes movement will cost you relationships. Not everyone can go where God is taking you. When you start moving in faith, you'll discover that some people were only attached to your comfort zone. They can't understand your stretching because they're satisfied staying where they are. Don't let their fear keep you stuck. You can love them and still leave them if obedience requires it. Faithful movement often means walking alone before you're joined by others who see what God is doing through you. Movement also tests your mindset. You can't step into a new dimension thinking like the old one. God will challenge your perspective because elevation begins internally before it manifests externally. You can't possess what you don't believe you're worthy of. Faith movement requires a renewed mind. One that says, if God said it, then I'm built for it. Every time you step in faith, your mind must agree with your spirit that what God promised is already yours. And here's the truth: movement doesn't mean it won't be scary. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's moving despite it. Every step of faith comes with a trembling hand and a racing heart. But faith whispers, do it anyway. Because the moment you move, fear loses its hold. God doesn't expect perfection. He expects participation. He wants to see your motion before He releases His manifestation. There's something powerful about momentum in the spirit. The moment you begin to move, things start to align. Doors start to open. Resources start to appear. People start to notice. Why? Because heaven responds to faith in motion. When you take a step, you're declaring, God, I trust you more than I trust what I see. That declaration shakes the atmosphere. It tells the enemy that you refuse to be paralyzed by doubt. Faith requires movement because God is a moving God. The Spirit hovered over the waters before creation began. It was movement that brought order out of chaos. Jesus didn't sit still when He called His disciples. He said, follow me. Every act of faith begins with following, and every follower must be willing to move when the Master calls. So if you've been praying for change, if you've been asking for elevation, understand this: comfort won't carry you there. Movement will. The next level will not meet you in your convenience. It will meet you in your courage. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to move in the direction of what God said. Faith steps even when sight shakes. Every time you move, you send a message to heaven that says, I'm ready. Ready to grow, ready to trust, ready to walk into what's next. Faith doesn't wait for the right time. It makes time right by moving. So, step out. Don't stay another day where God's grace has already lifted. Because every step you take in faith pulls you closer to the promise that was waiting all along. Faith requires movement, not comfort. And the moment you move, you'll discover that God has already gone before you, preparing a new dimension just for you. God uses discomfort to push you higher. It's one of the hardest truths to accept because everything in our human nature craves ease. We want the path to be smooth, the timing to be perfect, the process to be painless. But God is not in the business of keeping you comfortable. He's in the business of growing you. And growth never happens in comfort. Every level of elevation begins with an uncomfortable shift, a divine disturbance that forces you to stretch, to think differently, to depend on Him in ways you never have before. Discomfort is heaven's signal that change is coming. When things start to shake, when what used to work stops working, when doors close and familiar systems fail, it's not always the enemy. It's often God making sure you don't settle. He knows that if He lets you stay too long in the place you've outgrown, you'll start to confuse comfort with calling. So He shakes the nest to remind you that you were made to fly. You may feel like everything around you is falling apart, but in reality, things are falling into place. God is using what feels like pressure to prepare you for promotion. The truth is, elevation and ease never travel together. Every person God used mightily went through a season of discomfort that pushed them beyond their limits. Joseph was betrayed and imprisoned before he became second in command. Moses was driven into the wilderness before he became a deliverer. David was hunted before he was crowned. Even Jesus was rejected before he was resurrected. Each of them had to go through something that hurt, something that broke them, something that felt like a setback. But that pain was the very thing that positioned them for purpose. You see, discomfort is not God's rejection, it's His redirection. When you start feeling unsettled where you are, it's usually because God is calling you to something greater. The tension you feel is not punishment, it's transition. He's shifting you from one dimension to another, and the bridge between those two places is always uncomfortable. Faith must be stretched before it's strengthened. Vision must be refined before it's revealed, and character must be purified before it's promoted. That's why God allows the heat, because only fire separates gold from impurities. Sometimes the discomfort shows up in ways you didn't expect. It might be a relationship that ends, a job that no longer satisfies, a door that suddenly closes, or a season that feels dry. And in those moments, your first instinct is to ask, God, why? But what if the why isn't to hurt you, but to help you grow? What if He's using the tension to teach you how to trust Him without a safety net? You'll never know what's in you until God allows something to press on you. Pressure pulls out potential. When life squeezes you, what's inside begins to emerge. Think about a seed. Before it becomes a tree, it's buried in darkness. The soil covers it, presses it, confines it. If you didn't know better, you'd think the seed was being suffocated. But that pressure is what activates life inside of it. The same is true for you. God sometimes buries you in a season that feels dark and tight because He knows that's the only way your purpose can sprout. What looks like isolation is actually incubation. He's developing roots before He reveals fruit. Discomfort is the language of destiny. Every time you pray for God to take you higher, you are asking for a new level of stretching. You can't pray for growth and then complain about the growing pains. The higher you go, the stronger your foundation must be, and foundations are built in the pressure of preparation. God allows resistance because resistance builds resilience. If He made everything easy, you'd never develop the strength to sustain the blessing when it arrives. You might be in a place right now where everything feels uncertain. Nothing is working the way it used to. You're questioning whether you miss God or whether He's forgotten you. But hear this, He hasn't forgotten you. He's forming you. The same God who called you is still crafting you. You're in the workshop of discomfort, and He's molding you into something that can carry greater glory. When He's ready to elevate you, He won't have to check your strength, because the stretching already proved it. That's why some seasons hurt more than others, because the higher the call, the deeper the carving. God removes what can't go with you. Sometimes it's habits, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's parts of your own mindset. He'll strip away everything that limits your capacity. It's painful, but it's purposeful. Like a potter shaping clay, He presses and molds, not to destroy it, but to define it. The same hands that apply pressure also hold promise. You'll never see a butterfly without a cocoon. That dark, tight space is where transformation happens. The caterpillar doesn't die in the cocoon. It's redefined. The same thing happens to you when you go through uncomfortable seasons. You are being transformed into who you were always meant to be. The struggle is sacred because it means something is shifting. If you try to skip the process, you'll forfeit the strength. The very thing that's making you uncomfortable is what's preparing you to fly. When you start to see discomfort as divine, it changes your perspective. Instead of asking, God, get me out of this, you start saying, God, grow me through this. You stop fighting the pressure and start flowing with purpose. Because every season of discomfort carries a revelation. Something about God you couldn't learn in ease, and something about yourself you couldn't discover in calm. You learn that He's faithful even when you're frustrated. You learn that He's present even in the pain. You learn that His power works best when yours runs out. The next time you feel that holy unease, that restlessness that won't let you settle, don't despise it. Recognize it as a signal that God is moving. You're not losing control, you're being led. You're not breaking down, you're breaking through. That discomfort is not the end of your story. It's the evidence that God is still writing. So don't run from the pressure. Don't curse the process. Let the discomfort do its work. Because one day, you'll look back and realize that every tear, every test, every restless night was a tool in the hands of a faithful God who refused to let you stay small. The pain that once made you question Him will become the very thing that proves His power. God uses discomfort to push you higher. He shakes what you're standing on to show you you're meant to stand on Him. He removes what you've been leaning on to remind you that He alone is your foundation. And when you finally stop resisting and start trusting, you'll see what He was doing all along, using the pressure to propel you into purpose. The season that felt like breaking was actually your breakthrough. The storm that scared you was sent to strengthen you. And when it's all over, you'll understand that God never wanted to hurt you. He wanted to lift you. But elevation demands separation. It's one of the most challenging lessons in a believer's journey because separation feels like loss. But in truth, it's alignment. God cannot take you higher while you are still tied to what holds you down. Every step toward destiny requires a release of something that once felt necessary. The climb to purpose always comes with a cost. There is no elevation without separation, because the air is thinner at the top, and not everyone is built to breathe where God is taking you. When God begins to elevate you, He doesn't start by changing your surroundings. He starts by changing your connections. He will begin to pull you away from certain people, patterns, and places that are no longer aligned with where He's leading you. It's not rejection, it's refinement. The same crowd that clapped for you at one level cannot accompany you to the next. Some people are only anointed for your past. They were vital for your survival, but not meant for your success. If you try to drag everyone into your next dimension, their weight will become your weakness. Separation is never comfortable because it often feels like loneliness. You wonder why familiar voices fade and why doors you depended on suddenly close. But elevation requires clarity, and clarity often comes in isolation. God uses separation to silence the noise around you so you can finally hear His voice clearly. When Abraham was called to become the father of nations, the first thing God told him was, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household." The promise could not begin until he was willing to separate. Abraham had to walk away from the familiar to walk into the miraculous. You can't climb while clinging. Too many people miss their next because they're afraid to let go of their now. You can't soar if you're still attached to what's beneath you. God will often allow discomfort in your relationships or dissatisfaction in your environment, not to hurt you, but to help you move. The uneasiness is divine. It's heaven's nudge saying, it's time to go higher. The mountain is calling you, but you can't ascend with excess baggage. The higher you go, the less you can carry. Separation also reveals your strength. It shows you what you truly depend on. When God removes your crutches, He exposes whether you've been walking by faith or leaning on familiarity. Sometimes He'll allow people to walk away just to prove that His plan for you never depended on their presence. You thought you needed them to reach your destiny, but He's showing you that His anointing is enough. Every subtraction is a setup for divine multiplication. What you lose in quantity, you gain in quality. Elevation demands spiritual maturity because separation tests your emotions. You can't take offense when God chooses to prune you. Jesus said, "Every branch that bears fruit, He prunes so that it may bear more." Pruning isn't punishment, it's preparation. God cuts off what can't grow so what remains can flourish. It may hurt, but the pain has purpose. Each separation sharpens your focus and refines your heart. It forces you to depend less on people's approval and more on God's affirmation. There's also a separation from your old self. You can't step into your next level with the same mindset, habits, or insecurities that held you back before. God will challenge your thinking, confront your fears, and dismantle your comfort zones. The elevation He's preparing for you requires a renewed identity. You are not who you used to be, and you cannot think like who you were if you want to become who you're called to be. The transformation begins when you finally separate from the version of you that's settled. Sometimes the hardest part is that separation doesn't always come with explanation. God may not tell you why a relationship ended or why a door closed. You may not understand why people who once supported you suddenly turned silent. But trust that divine silence often hides sacred strategy. God sees what you cannot see. He's protecting you from distractions disguised as comfort. What feels like rejection is often redirection towards something far greater. Even Jesus experienced separation before elevation. Before His public ministry began, the Spirit led Him into the wilderness, alone. No followers, no crowd, no comfort. The wilderness was a place of testing, proving, and strengthening. And when He emerged, He came out in power. That's what God is doing in your season of separation. He's stripping away what's unnecessary so the power within you can emerge. You're not being abandoned, you're being anointed. When God elevates you, He separates you from anything that competes with His voice. That includes distractions, doubt, and even your own dependence on outcomes. He'll bring you to a place where He is all you have so you can discover that He's all you need. In that sacred solitude, you'll learn that isolation is not always an enemy. It's an incubator. The greatest ideas, callings, and breakthroughs are conceived in hidden places. What God births in private will be revealed in power. You must also understand that separation is seasonal. God doesn't isolate you forever. He isolates you to prepare you. Once you're ready, He reconnects you with the right people, those who are aligned with your assignment. Elevation shifts your circle because destiny requires agreement. You'll begin to attract people who match your next level, not your last one. Don't grieve the ones who left. Make room for the ones who are coming. Separation also strengthens your discernment. The higher you go, the more distractions will appear, and not every opportunity will be divine. Some doors are traps disguised as blessings. But when you've been separated and shaped by God, you'll recognize His voice in every decision. You'll stop chasing approval and start following assignment. Elevation is not about being above others. It's about being closer to purpose. It's about walking in alignment with the will of God, even when it costs your comfort, your crowd, or your convenience. Separation is the evidence that you're being trusted with more. God doesn't separate you because you're weak. He separates you because you're ready. So if you're in a season where people are drifting away, where the familiar no longer fits, don't fight it. Don't force what God is finished with. Let go with grace. Trust that what's leaving your life is making space for what's next. Every goodbye carries the seed of a greater hello. The elevation you prayed for requires this pruning. One day, you'll look back and realize that the separation that broke your heart was the same moment your spirit began to rise. The pain of parting became the path to purpose. The isolation birthed insight. The rejection revealed resilience. God was never taking something from you. He was making something of you. And when you finally step into the place He's been preparing, you'll understand that elevation always demands separation. But the view from the top makes every lonely step worth it. Your next dimension is unlocked by obedience. Not talent, not connections, not ambition. Obedience. In the kingdom of God, promotion doesn't come by popularity, it comes by submission. You can have dreams, plans, and gifts, but until your will aligns with His will, the door to your next dimension will remain closed. God doesn't elevate disobedience. He elevates those who listen, trust, and move when He speaks, even when it doesn't make sense. Obedience is the master key that opens every divine door. So often, people pray for breakthrough while ignoring the last instruction God gave them. They want God to reveal the next step while they're still negotiating the first one. But obedience doesn't wait for explanation. It moves on revelation. You may not understand what God is doing, but you obey because you trust who He is. That's what separates ordinary believers from extraordinary ones: obedience in uncertainty. Faith is not proven in shouting and singing, it's proven in doing. When God told Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a place He would show him, Abraham didn't get a map, he got a word. He obeyed, and that obedience unlocked generations of blessing. Every time you say yes to God, you're not just shifting your own story, you're setting in motion a legacy. Obedience plants seeds that outlive you. What you do in faith today determines what others will inherit tomorrow. That's why your obedience matters. It's bigger than you. Obedience often requires sacrifice. It's not convenient, and it rarely feels comfortable. Sometimes it means walking away from people you love, opportunities that look good, or places that feel safe. God will test whether you trust Him more than what you can see. He'll ask you to lay down what you've built to pick up what He's birthing. When He told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, it wasn't because God wanted the boy. It was because He wanted Abraham's heart. And once Abraham proved his obedience, the blessing was released. The ram was already in the thicket, but it didn't appear until obedience was demonstrated. Provision always follows obedience. Many people want divine elevation, but resist divine instruction. They pray for doors to open while ignoring the keys God placed in their hands. Obedience is that key. God doesn't bless good intentions. He blesses faithful actions. You can't just hear His word. You must walk it out. Every miracle in the Bible was triggered by someone doing something God said. The widow poured oil. Peter cast the net again. The servants filled the jars with water. Their obedience unlocked overflow. The challenge is that obedience often feels like risk. It asks you to step out without guarantees. It forces you to move without seeing the outcome. But that's the essence of faith, trusting God's instruction more than your own insight. If you only obey when it makes sense, you're not walking by faith, you're walking by logic. God is not obligated to explain Himself before He elevates you. He's looking for those who will obey, even when the direction feels strange. Sometimes obedience means doing the small thing faithfully before God trusts you with the big thing. David didn't start on the throne. He started in the field. His obedience to serve, to protect sheep, to play the harp for a tormented king, prepared him for the palace. God will always test you privately before He promotes you publicly. What you do when no one's watching determines how high you'll go when everyone's watching. Obedience in the unseen seasons builds strength for the visible ones. There will also be times when obedience costs you relationships. Not everyone will understand your yes to God. Some will call you foolish for walking away from what looks secure. Others will question your choices or distance themselves because your obedience exposes their complacency. Don't let that stop you. Every level of obedience attracts a different kind of opposition. But the same God who called you will sustain you. He never requires something from you without preparing something for you. It's also important to understand that delayed obedience is still disobedience. Every time you hesitate, you delay your harvest. The moment God gives an instruction, He attaches timing to it. The blessing is tied to your prompt response. When Peter stepped out of the boat, he walked on water. But if he had waited a few seconds too long, the opportunity might have passed. Some miracles are time sensitive. That's why immediate obedience matters. Obedience also reveals your level of trust. You can't say you trust God and still disobey Him. Every act of obedience is a declaration that says, God, I believe you know better than I do. It's surrender in action. It's faith translated into motion. And when heaven sees that posture of submission, doors begin to open that your strength could never pry apart. The next dimension isn't unlocked by hustle, it's unlocked by humility. Sometimes God will test your obedience in the area of your greatest desire. He'll ask for the very thing you prayed for just to see if it owns your heart. If you can release it back to Him, He knows He can trust you with more. The quicker you obey, the quicker you accelerate. The slower you obey, the longer you delay your destiny. Obedience is the elevator that takes you from promise to performance. Look at Jesus. He was the ultimate example of obedience. Even when facing the cross, he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." That obedience didn't just elevate him, it elevated all of humanity. Because he obeyed, we were redeemed. Because he submitted, we were saved. If obedience could unlock resurrection power in Christ, it can unlock transformation in you. Sometimes you won't feel ready. You'll question your ability, your resources, your timing. But God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. All he's asking for is your yes. The power doesn't show up until obedience does. The moment you move, grace meets you. The supernatural always follows submission. You might be standing at the threshold of your next dimension right now, waiting for God to move. But maybe he's waiting for you, waiting for your yes, waiting for you to stop analyzing and start obeying. The door is not locked. It's waiting for the key of obedience to turn. Every breakthrough, every blessing, every new level you've been praying for is on the other side of one simple step. Do what God said. Your obedience today sets the trajectory of your tomorrow. Every time you respond in faith, heaven takes notice. Every time you obey, you prove that you trust the author of your destiny. And when you trust him, he can take you places your effort never could. The next dimension isn't about striving. It's about surrender. It's not about knowing all the answers. It's about following the one who is the answer. When God speaks, move. When he instructs, respond. When he says go, don't hesitate. Because every act of obedience is a bridge between where you are and where you're called to be. The next dimension is waiting. But it will only unlock when your obedience turns the key. Fear blocks what faith builds. It stands like a wall between you and the destiny God designed for you. Fear whispers lies that sound like logic. It convinces you to stay safe, to stay small, to stay silent when God is calling you to stand up and step out. Fear will always disguise itself as wisdom, but it's really a thief, stealing courage, confidence, and calling. It builds barriers in the mind long before any obstacle shows up in life. But faith tears those barriers down. Faith doesn't wait for fear to leave. It moves despite it. Faith sees what fear hides and believes what fear denies. Every person who ever did something great for God had to face fear. Moses feared speaking, yet God made him a leader. Gideon feared his weakness, yet God called him a warrior. Esther feared the throne room, yet God used her to save a nation. Fear was present in all their stories, but faith gave them the courage to act anyway. The difference between those who fulfill their purpose and those who never do is not the absence of fear. It's the presence of faith strong enough to move through it. Fear is persuasive. It plays on your past failures and amplifies your insecurities. It reminds you of every time you tried and didn't succeed, every door that closed, every voice that doubted you. But faith answers back. Faith says, if God called me, I'm equipped for it. Faith says, I may have failed before, but this time I'm walking with divine backing. Fear tells you what you can't do. Faith reminds you of who you are in God. Fear magnifies the problem. Faith magnifies the promise. The truth is, you can't build in both fear and faith at the same time. One will cancel the other. When fear is in charge, progress stops. When faith takes the lead, miracles happen. That's why the enemy works so hard to fill you with fear. Because he knows he can't destroy your purpose, but he can paralyze your movement. As long as you're afraid to move, he doesn't have to fight you. You become your own barrier. Fear locks you out of rooms God already opened for you. It whispers, "You're not ready," when God already said, "Now is the time." A faith, however, builds forward. It doesn't deny the storm, it just decides that the storm won't stop it. Peter walked on water not because the sea was calm, but because his eyes were fixed on Jesus instead of the waves. The moment he looked at the wind, he began to sink. That's what fear does. It shifts your focus from the Savior to the situation. It makes the waves look bigger than the Word, but faith keeps its eyes locked on the promise, even while the storm rages. Fear is rooted in control. It thrives when you demand to know how things will work out before you move. But faith flourishes in surrender. It trusts God enough to move without the map. You can't control and believe at the same time. Control says, "Show me first." Faith says, "I'll step first." And every time you choose faith over fear, heaven responds with power. The tragedy is that many people spend their entire lives building walls of fear instead of bridges of faith. They talk about what they could have done, what they should have tried, what they might have become. But fear kept them stuck. They waited for perfect timing, for more confirmation, for clearer signs, but what they didn't realize is that fear will always find a reason not to move. If you wait until you're fearless, you'll wait forever. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to trust God more than what scares you. Fear also disguises itself as comparison. You start looking at others and measuring your journey against theirs, and suddenly you feel unqualified. But faith says, "I don't need to be them, I just need to be obedient." God didn't call you to copy, He called you to create. What He placed inside you is unique, and fear tries to convince you that your uniqueness is inadequacy. But the truth is, your difference is your design. You were built to stand out, not to blend in. Sometimes fear shows up as delay. You tell yourself you're waiting on God, but in reality, He's waiting on you. The hesitation is not holy. It's fear disguised as caution. Faith moves even when it doesn't have all the answers. It steps into the unknown with the confidence that if God led you there, He'll meet you there. The walls of Jericho didn't fall because of fear. They fell because of faithful obedience. Every step around that wall was an act of defiance against fear. Fear also attacks the mind. It feeds you scenarios that haven't even happened, convincing you that failure is certain. But faith renews the mind. It replaces anxious imagination with divine expectation. Instead of saying, "What if it doesn't work?" faith asks, "What if it does?" What if the very thing you've been afraid to try is the thing God wants to use to change your life? What if the fear you've been feeding is the only thing standing between you and your next dimension? Faith doesn't need to see the outcome to take the step. It believes that if God gave the vision, He already has the provision. Fear says, "What if I fall?" Faith says, "What if I fly?" Every breakthrough, every blessing, every new level requires a decision. To feed faith or feed fear. One grows while the other dies. You can't entertain both and expect to move forward. Even Jesus addressed fear head on. When He told the disciples, "Do not be afraid," He wasn't suggesting it, He was commanding it. Because fear is not just an emotion, it's a spirit. And God has not given us the spirit of fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind. When you operate in faith, you step into divine authority. You stop reacting to life and start directing it. You might feel fear, but you don't have to follow it. You can acknowledge it and still act. You can feel nervous and still obey. You can tremble and still take the step, Because faith doesn't wait for your feelings to catch up. It moves and lets feelings follow. Every time you push through fear, you weaken its grip. Every time you obey in spite of it, you strengthen your spiritual muscle. Fear builds walls that confine, but faith builds doors that open. Fear looks for safety, but faith looks for destiny. The next time fear tells you it's too late, too risky, too big, remember who's backing you. God wouldn't give you a vision he didn't plan to fulfill. If he said go, then he's already gone before you. Fear may knock, but faith answers the door. So stand tall, lift your head, walk forward even if your knees shake. You don't have to wait until fear disappears to move. You just have to move until faith dominates. Every step you take in faith chips away at the walls fear built around you. And when those walls fall, you'll see that everything you were afraid of was smaller than the God who called you. Fear blocks what faith builds. But the moment you choose faith, fear loses its power, and the future God promised becomes your present reality. Stepping out activates divine acceleration. There are moments in life when obedience doesn't just move you forward, it multiplies your momentum. When you take that one step of faith, you unlock movement in the unseen realm. God doesn't accelerate the stationary, he accelerates the moving. As long as you stay stuck in hesitation, heaven has nothing to propel. But the moment you step out, even if it's shaky, even if it's uncertain, the Spirit of God begins to breathe on your movement. What looked like a small step in the natural becomes a giant leap in the spiritual. God's pattern has always been to meet motion with multiplication. When the widow poured out her oil, it flowed only as long as she poured. When Peter cast his net at Jesus' command, the fish didn't show up until he threw it into the deep. When Joshua's priests stepped into the Jordan, the waters didn't part until their feet touched it. In every instance, divine acceleration followed a human act of obedience. You don't need the full picture, you need the courage to make the first move. Many people pray for speed but resist stepping. They want progress without participation, promotion without preparation, increase without initiative. But God's power is released through partnership. He said, "You draw near to me, and I'll draw near to you." That's divine acceleration. It's God closing the distance between where you are and where you're meant to be the moment you move toward Him. When faith steps forward, grace rushes in to meet it. Acceleration doesn't mean skipping the process. It means God compresses time. He redeems the years you thought were wasted. He brings back opportunities you thought were lost. He positions you in rooms you didn't even have time to plan for. What takes others years begins to unfold for you in months, sometimes days, because heaven recognizes movement. God can work with a mover. He can't bless a statue. Faith that moves, even if it trembles, creates a divine response. Stepping out means leaving behind what's predictable. And that's where many people get stuck. You want the next level, but you're clinging to the last one. You're praying for new doors while holding on to old handles. But acceleration only happens when you release what's behind you. God won't pour new oil into old vessels. The reason He's asking you to step out is because the next dimension can't fit in your current situation. What you're carrying is too big for the space you're standing in. Divine acceleration often looks slow at first. It starts small, unnoticed, even uncomfortable. But that's how faith works. It builds momentum as you move, like a plane that requires speed to lift. Your obedience creates the thrust for your elevation. Every step you take gathers spiritual speed. At first, It feels like nothing's happening. But then suddenly, what was heavy becomes light. What was delayed begins to move. What was hard starts to flow. You realize God was aligning the atmosphere for lift off all along. You can't experience acceleration if you're anchored in fear. Fear keeps your feet on the ground when your wings were designed for the sky. Fear says, wait until everything makes sense. Faith says, move before everything makes sense. God blesses boldness, not hesitation. The step that looks risky in the natural often unlocks miracles in the supernatural. Divine acceleration doesn't come to those who wait passively. It comes to those who walk in purpose. Stepping out also activates divine timing. There are doors that only open when your movement and God's moment align. If you stay still when it's time to move, you'll miss the window. That's why obedience is time sensitive. The miracle is often waiting on your motion. The longer you wait, the more delayed your destiny becomes. But the moment you act, heaven synchronizes everything to push you forward. God doesn't need time. He uses your obedience to overtake it. When Elijah outran Ahab's chariot, it wasn't because he was faster. It was because divine acceleration was on him. When Joseph went from prison to palace in a single day, it wasn't luck. It was God's timing meeting his preparation. When the disciples left their nets and followed Jesus, their lives shifted from ordinary to extraordinary. That's what stepping out does. It doesn't just change your location, it changes your dimension. Divine acceleration doesn't mean you won't face opposition. It means opposition can't outrun God's plan. The enemy will always try to distract you right before your breakthrough, because he knows that once you step out, you'll move too fast for him to catch. The storm might rage, the path might shake, but God's favor will carry you faster than fear can follow. When heaven puts wind behind your obedience, no demon can delay your destiny. Sometimes acceleration looks like divine connections. God's sending people into your path who open doors you couldn't open on your own. Sometimes it's sudden revelation, ideas, clarity, strategies that come out of nowhere. Sometimes it's opportunity that seems too good to be true. That's not coincidence, that's confirmation. God responds to faith with movement. He multiplies what you put in motion. The key is to start where you are. Stop waiting for perfect timing. Stop saying, once I'm ready. Readiness is revealed in your response. When God told Abram to leave his father's house, he didn't give him a map. He gave him a command. The direction came after the decision. Every great story in Scripture begins with someone stepping out, not because they had everything figured out, but because they trusted the one who called them. Divine acceleration also exposes alignment. When you step where God tells you to, you'll notice certain things fall away. People, habits, places that can't go with you. Don't mourn what leaves, celebrate what's revealed. God is trimming the weight so you can run faster. You can't soar while dragging what was meant for the last season. Acceleration requires alignment, and alignment requires release. You might not see the results immediately, but acceleration is not about what you see, it's about what's set in motion. Seeds don't sprout the moment they're planted, but once they break through, they grow rapidly. That's how divine acceleration works. The unseen becomes visible all at once because it's been growing underground. Every prayer, every step, every act of faith builds unseen velocity until suddenly you're living in what you only imagined. So when God says, step out, don't analyze it, activate it. Move even if it means leaving comfort. Move even if it means being misunderstood. Move. even if you're unsure what's next. Because once you step, heaven sends speed. Divine acceleration doesn't come to those who wait to see. It comes to those who believe enough to move. The moment your feet leave the familiar, grace meets you with power. The road may look long, but acceleration makes it short. What would have taken years will take months. What was once out of reach will suddenly be within grasp. You'll realize that you didn't get there by might or by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord pushing you forward. Stepping out activates divine acceleration, because God never moves at the pace of fear. He moves at the pace of faith. And when you move with Him, what took others a lifetime will happen for you in divine time. When you look back over your life, you'll realize that every moment of stretching, every season of discomfort, and every act of courage was leading you to this one truth. God never meant for you to stay where you started. Every test, every trial, every tear was preparation for elevation. You've been asking God to change your situation, but God has been using your situation to change you. This message, step out, God is elevating you to the next dimension, is not just inspiration, it's a divine instruction. You can't move to the next level holding on to the weight of the last one. You can't walk in new purpose with an old mindset. The same faith that got you here won't be the faith that takes you there. God is calling you higher, not because you're qualified, but because you're chosen.